Okay, let's get straight into VS Code and create something useful. I want to create a new file. So, right-click, New File. And this one I'll name multiplication.py. This program is going to demonstrate how to use nested loops and why they're useful. We want to create a program that will ask the user for an input of a number. It will store that number as an integer. We can then use that number in a series of loops to print out a multiplication chart, start from 1 and ending with the number the user entered. I will use a lot of comments throughout this program. This really just helps us see what each line of code is doing. When the program is run, all comments are ignored by the interpreter. The interpreter is the thing that converts what you write into something the computer can understand. We won't worry about that for now. Just know you can add as many comments as you need to help you understand how a program works, and it won't affect the program. So, the first thing we need to do is prompt the user for input and store that input in a variable as an integer. We can have a variable named number. We will set that equal to int and a pair of parentheses. This ensures the variable is stored as an integer. Then we can put our input prompt inside the int parenthesis. We'll ask the user to input a number between 1 and 20. We have to include the int, because without that, the input, even when it is a number, will be stored as a string, and we cannot perform mathematical operations on a string. So, let me just run this and ensure it works. It really does pay to run your program after adding a few lines of code. This will allow you to catch errors early on, and everything is working as expected. But we do need to print something out to the console. I'll just print the number a couple of times. Remember to put a comma between the variables. Thinking ahead, I will be wanting to display a neatly organized multiplication table, with all the columns lined up so that it is easy to read. But just printing the numbers, one after the other, isn't going to work. The rows will not line up how I want them to. I need to create more space between each number. A tab would be nice, so how do we add that? In Python, we can add a string, so with the quotation marks. And inside that type, \t. This will print a tabbed space between our numbers. If we go ahead and run this again, we will see it prints our inputted number, followed by a tabbed space, then our inputted number again. That's perfect. Again, I'm going to add a couple of empty print statements at the top of our program and at the bottom of our program. These serve no functional purpose. I'm only adding them to separate our output from the standard terminal text. I find it easier to read our output that way. It is time to add the first of our two loops. I'm going to type for row in range and then some parenthesis. Inside the parentheses, we'll enter our range parameters, which will be 1 as we want to start from 1, comma, and then number. As we want to run this loop for a number of times equal to the number the user entered. So if they entered 10, we want to run the loop 10 times. Finally, we have to end our for statement with a colon. Let's put a print statement inside our for loop and print something. This way, we can check it is looping the correct number of times. I'll just print the row value, which is 1 on the first iteration of the loop, and I'll multiply it by 2. I'll finish with end equals, and that tab string we used earlier, because I don't want every number printed on a new line. When it loops the first time, it should print 2 because 1 times 2 is 2. On the second iteration, row now equals 2, so it would calculate 2 times 2 and print 4. It should repeat this for the number of times the user inputted. Before I can run this, I need to fix this indentation. Python is very fussy about correct indentation. Okay, so running this again, we'll enter 10 and press enter. But something's wrong. We entered 10, but we only got 9 outputs. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. Where is our 20? What is happening is that range counts up to, but not including, our 10. So we're only getting loops 1 to 9, then it stops at 10 and doesn't run the loop. This is an easy fix. Instead of our range limit being our variable number, we'll make it our variable number plus 1. This way, if the user enters 15, it will loop from 1 to 15 and then stop the loop on 16, one higher than the user input. Let's run it again and see if we fix that issue. I'll enter 10 again and press enter. Job done, 2 to 20. 10 outputs. Things are going good. Now, we will create a second loop, but we will nest it inside the first loop. To do this, just ensure the second loop is tabbed in by 1. We'll name this loop column instead of row, but the rest, including the range, is the same. I need to tab this print statement in further so that it is inside our second loop. And I also want to tab this empty print statement in by 1. This puts it inside our first loop instead of outside of it. But it isn't inside our second loop, as it is on the same level. Now I need to change our calculation so that instead of multiplying by 2, we are multiplying the row count by the column count. Let's run this again. We'll enter 12 as our input, and what do we get? Awesome! We did it. A multiplication table, nicely formatted. Now I can easily see my 8 times table, or my 11 times table. We'll run it again. This time, I want to go to 15, and it is working perfectly. And best of all, that really didn't take many lines of code. With those nested loops, using the inputted value of 15, we are actually running that row times column calculation 225 times. This is because in each and every iteration of the first loop, that second loop is running 15 times before the first loop enters its second iteration. Let us comment this code out a lot more. Try and get a better understand of exactly what is happening here. So we have our first loop that runs a total of n times, with n being whatever number the user inputted. Everything inside this loop is executed, then the loop counter moves to 2, and everything is executed again. Inside of this, we have our second loop. While this works in the same way, it is important to note that this runs a total of n times, again with n being whatever the user inputted, before it allows the first loop to enter its second iteration. So for every loop of the first loop, we get 15 loops of the second loop, if the user entered 15. And then we have our print statement. This does our calculation and prints the result. The result printed is followed by that tab space. What we end up with is our first row of multiplication. The first loop counter stays at 1 because we're still in the first iteration. So it goes 1 times 1. Then column counter becomes 2, so 1 times 2. Each time printing the result followed by a tab. Once it has completed the required number of loops, it breaks out of the second loop back into the first loop. Back in the first loop, this print statement only has one job. Previously, we printed everything on one line. Before we print the next row for the second iteration, we want to now move on to a new line. So, we are creating a loop. Let's say the user enters 10. That loop will run 10 times. The first thing it will do is enter that second loop. This will run 10 times, performing the calculation and printing the results, all on one line to create our first row. Each time this loop runs, it increases the column counter by 1. We end up with row times 1, row times 2, etc., where row is equal to 1 on the first loop. And actually, because the second loop is the one printing the row, I should change the names. I have named them wrong. The first loop is for the columns, the second loop is for the rows. I really should make sure the names make logical sense. So let me switch them around. It won't affect our calculation though. Now, once that second loop has run a total of n times, it exits that loop, and the next line of code is that empty print statement to move on to a new line. It does that, then it runs the second iteration of loop 1, where column, because I just switched them, is now 2. That second loop will run again, this time printing the 2 times table. Really, even though we're asking for a number between 1 and 20, we could accept any integer. I only limited to 20 because of screen space. Going to 55 would mean a row wouldn't actually fit on one row, and our layout would be messed up. And that is it for this video. Any questions? Post them in the comments. I'll try to answer any questions that get posted. And as always, please like and subscribe. The next video, I plan to build a binary to decimal and decimal to binary converter. So watch out for that one. Bye for now.